Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and I would also like to welcome you to the very first installment of the Worst Map Ever series. Now, kicking things off, because this is the first installment in the series, I actually want to briefly go over what this series is and what I'm going to be looking at. I started looking at this idea when I noticed that every time War Thunder would drop a new ground RB map, the players were very quick to label the brand new map as the worst map they had ever seen, and the same goes for whenever the developers change an existing map. And this generally happened like clockwork, even for maps that I actually felt were pretty well designed and tend to have a pretty good play flow. So in that respect, I thought going through various War Thunder maps, their strengths, their weaknesses, how to generally play them, and the types of vehicles that are strong on them might actually be a pretty useful series for a lot of players, and also an interesting opportunity to look at what actually makes good and bad maps for this game. For our inaugural map for this series, we're going to be looking at Attica. Attica currently only has one variant, which is a triple cap variant, so that is the only map that we'll be looking at. In the future, if we do look at a map, we will also be looking at all variants and the various aspects it changes when you do go into the different versions of the map. As far as the overall size of the map, it's around 1.5 kilometers square, so this does put it on the smaller end of War Thunder maps, although it's not anywhere near the smallest. Now, the first major map attribute that I always like to look at, because it does determine a lot of the game flow, is the capture points. Generally speaking, a lot of players will migrate towards capture points because obviously these drain tickets from the opposing team and ultimately can help you win the game. The A point and the B point on Attica are in somewhat awkward positions. I would describe them as a bit of an island, because while there is cover on the A point and B point for you to successfully capture it, once you've captured it, it's actually very difficult to move out from the A point or B point to anywhere else without simply getting sniped. In that respect, this is a somewhat unusual feature, as generally War Thunder maps getting from points that you've recently captured, even if it's just going back the way you came, isn't that difficult, and there aren't a ton of them that it's incredibly hard to get off of once you've captured. And it's also pretty uncommon for a map to have two such capture points on the same map. The C point, however, is quite different, as it's a lot easier to get both onto and off of it without exposing yourself to too much enemy fire. So in that respect, the C point is the easiest one to cap and survive afterwards. Now, in terms of your major movement lanes, Attica effectively has 3 movement lanes per side. You have the far left, the middle, and the far right. Both spawn zones can effectively feed into the middle, but it does ultimately go into the same place with some very similar positions. Now, one big note with Attica, and this is different for some of the more open maps, is that the movement lanes on Attica are very rigid. It's not simply that they are a singular lane, but rather there is very little room to move to the left or right of the lane. So there's not a ton of flanking opportunities that don't simply take you directly in contact with the enemy force. In this respect, basically every lane you take on Attica could be referred to as a headbutt lane. You're basically driving directly towards the enemy no matter where you go, and the enemy is likewise driving directly towards you. Now, one thing that's not immediately obvious on Attica unless you've played on the map a good bit is that the area that is highlighted is a bowl. Essentially, you have ridges on all sides that are all looking down, and the A and B points are heavily recessed. What this effectively means is that from an overhead map, it looks like you have some cover around A and B, but in practice, because you're basically going downhill and the enemy has elevated positions, the whole area is very open. It's almost like a giant courtyard with multiple sniping vantage points. So in that respect, all of these positions around the bowl essentially are power positions. They are positions that are often difficult to contest and virtually impossible to flank. This has a particularly interesting interaction with the movement lanes, because the movement lanes are fairly narrow and basically all of them funnel you into these power positions that can overlook the bowl. This means that movement within the bowl is actually fairly difficult, and you'll also notice these two positions here. These positions are right outside of the spawn and are on the natural path you would take to get to C, and also allow you to overlook a sizable section of the bowl. So even if you're trying to hug the enemy side of the bowl as much as possible so the enemies can't shoot down on you, you might just accidentally get shot in the side by somebody who is coming off of spawn towards the C point. Now, unlike the A and B point, the C point actually does have very good coverage going to the C point, and the gaps you have to cross in order to get to where you're going are going to be relatively light, at least compared with these rather sizable gaps you'll have to cross going from A to B. If you're trying to get to a point without getting shot, and you're also trying to get off of that point without getting shot, C is definitely the correct pick. That being said, the north spawn going to C actually has this weird little, I call it an idiot trap. It is actually a longer way to get to C, even though on the surface it looks like it's a shortcut, because A, it takes more time than simply driving down the road, and B, it's not a road, so it has worse terrain modifiers. At a glance, it looks like it is going towards the direction of C and might get you there faster, but in reality it is actually slightly slower to get to C. And getting to C quickly and getting control of C quickly is actually important. In fact, getting control of any part of this map quickly is actually incredibly important, because once both teams get set up in their respective sniper positions, movement on this map becomes very difficult. Now, while once you have control of C, you do have some options in terms of where to go. Trying to push out into the main bowl area is still incredibly risky because you're still opening yourself up to a lot of line of sight, and as discussed earlier, those two positions coming off of spawn will just kind of see you by accident, so even if you're being very careful, it is very easy to get caught out, especially because the area right outside C that you would use to go to B is actually pretty exposed with very little cover. What this means in practice is that while C does have the most options, the most natural route in which you're unlikely to get caught out is simply to stuff the enemy team in their spawn from one of these two power positions. From a standpoint of prominent terrain features, Attica is actually both very interesting and very not interesting at the same time. You do have the ancient ruins at A, B, and C that can provide some element of cover, although on the whole the map is fairly sparse in terms of cover, and what you actually get is a lot of rock formations. However, these rock formations are probably my least favorite terrain features in the entire game and do a lot to slow down the map flow of Attica. The most prominent characteristic of basically all of these large rock formations on Attica is that they are perfectly the wrong size. They are big enough to hide your vehicle, but not big enough to stop your third-person camera from looking over them. This creates a really unfortunate situation when you're trying to come off spawn and actually take some positive action on the map, wherein enemies hiding behind these rock formations will have full information on you at all times. This is also very awkward if you're trying to move around the middle of the map, because there are several of these rock formations that enemies will just hide behind, wait for you to be looking the other direction, and then come out and ambush you. These rock formations are kind of terrible as far as terrain features. They also are not tall enough to provide any meaningful cover from air attack, which is its own separate problem. Additionally, a lot of these rock formations have what I'll just call tails. These are basically mounds of rocks that are extending past the formation itself, and these mounds of dirt and gravel are basically exactly the right height to hide the lower front plate of some vehicles and even the entire hull of others. So it not only provides you with great vision and not only provides you with a nice way to hide from the enemy, but when you do have to pop out and take a shot, it provides you with excellent cover to hide weak points. What these rock formations essentially mean for the map flow is that Attica is very defense heavy. It's difficult to approach somebody who has this rock formation in their advantage, especially because you don't always know what rock formations the enemies are hiding behind, because they are generally tall enough to hide opponents. This naturally leads into another somewhat awkward part of Attica, and that is the general lack of trees. Attica doesn't really have any large forests, the trees are very sparse and not very big. So in essence, you are completely exposed, none of the rocks are really tall enough to block you from air attacks, and a lot of the map is a giant bowl. And it turns out while the rocks are not large enough to hide you from air attacks, they are large enough that a clever plane can simply bounce a bomb off of one if you're close by one to get an easy kill. The only real parts of the map with meaningful cover and concealment against air attack are actually the capture points themselves, and out of them, C is the only one that's readily accessible. This also naturally leads into another quirk of Attica when it comes to dealing with aircraft, and that is, the map is effectively on a plateau. That is to say, the ocean around you is at a noticeably lower elevation. This means unless your anti-air is going all the way down to the ocean, they're probably not going to be able to see and hit aircraft that are flying at low level, and this does allow for easy ambushes from things like helicopters. Now, as far as general tips and playstyles for Attica, there are some vehicle-specific tips. If you have a tank destroyer with particularly heavy frontal armor, or even a heavy tank with heavy frontal armor that is generally hard to penetrate by vehicles at its battle rating, what you can do is you can take up these sniping positions around the bowl. These are going to be vehicles like the Jagdtiger, like the Object 268, the T-95, and also the Tortoise. Additionally, most heavy tanks can at least do this to some extent, such as a Jumbo. The lines of sight that you will have on the bowl are actually pretty difficult for the enemy to nail fairly small weak points, and if the enemy does try to come up for a shot, because there's such a steep elevation going up into the sniping positions to get to the bowl, it's actually kind of difficult for the enemy to get a shot without you noticing them and being able to react and put a shot into them first. So these very heavily armored vehicles can simply hold positions around the bowl pretty easily all game without without being contested unless somebody manages to get in a cheeky shot with something like a heat round. Additionally, if you do have light and fast vehicles such as the British Fox or the American 800T that are very quick for their battle rating, you can rush to the enemy side of the bowl very quickly and simply hug the rim, and if you do this, the enemy will have a very difficult time shooting you without getting sniped by your teammates. This gives your team an incredible amount of map control early on and basically removes your opponent's option to move into the bowl or around A or B. For a lot of your more mobile tanks, such as medium tanks and even to an extent some heavies though, the C point is probably going to be your best bet to have an impact on the battlefield without simply resorting to a sniping camping fest. This is especially true if your vehicle doesn't have a ton of armor, because C provides you the most opportunity to get hard cover without getting shot from a ton of different angles. Now, as one last shout out, and this is a much more battle rating specific strategy, there are several vehicles in the game that have elevated missile launchers that have really good gun depression, and these vehicles can have an absolute field day. These will be vehicles like the M901, the Mephisto, or the Afti. All three of these vehicles have high-mounted missile launchers that also have great depression, so you can peek over a lot of these hills, and you can even peek over quite a few of the rock formations in ways where the enemy can't really shoot anything but your launcher, and the launchers do tend to be relatively small and hard to hit targets. These types of vehicles can have an absolute field day on Attica if they get set up. That being said, it is important to note in regards to gun depression that a lot of the angles, especially around the bowl, you actually need incredibly good gun depression to be able to fire down without exposing a lot of your vehicles. Most tanks in the game are going to have to expose a good chunk, if not all of their vehicles, to get in a position where they can actually shoot down far enough. So in that respect, it's actually more important to have good power to weight ratio and reverse gear than it is to have good gun depression if you're going to have a vehicle working the bowl. As for my closing thoughts on Attica, the cons for the map are fairly self-explanatory. A and B point tend to be almost completely exposed, are difficult to get access to, and are difficult to get off of, and it results in a lot of sniping fest where it feels like any movement gets punished. On top of that, because the natural movement lanes take you into power positions, even players that are just pressing W until they see a red name tag and shooting at it are naturally going to find themselves in relatively good positions to snipe you. While C probably has the best movement opportunities, C also naturally pushes you into a spawn camp because there aren't really any meaningful flanking routes on most of this map. So on the whole, the map is very defense heavy. Once a team gets set up in and around the bowl, and with spawn camps around C, it's very hard to push out to any meaningful degree. And in this respect, the map tends to be very steamrolly. It's difficult to make progress once you start getting pushed back, so once you start getting pushed back, you just stay pushed back. You ultimately end up fighting out of your spawn within the first few minutes. That being said, Attica does have two small saving graces, and the first one is the spawns are actually somewhat defensible. This is obviously a bit of a backhanded compliment. If I'm using the spawns so much to defend, then it's probably a bad sign, but at least you can somewhat defend the spawn, unlike other maps where it's a little too easy to get positions that basically you can't contest from spawn. The second upside, and this is also a bit of a backhanded compliment, is that Attica plays very well on lower team sizes. I actually got two Attica maps where there were only 8 players per side, and those maps played incredibly well because it turns out when you don't have 16 players that are just going to naturally set up at every available sniping spot, the map actually does open up a fair bit and you can move around a lot more without simply getting shot from 100 different angles. Obviously, the smaller 8v8 games are kind of rare, but this did have me pondering whether or not Attica could be a good competitive map. Ultimately, some of the other concerns about the map don't really matter as much in a competitive setting where you only have 4 or 5 players on the map, and teams would have to selectively choose which power positions they want to occupy and which players they want to make pushes to try and capture zones. I honestly think that War Thunder should consider this map for competitive games because I do feel like with a smaller player count, the map is actually pretty interesting, and it's also visually a lot less cluttered than a map like Advance to the Rhine, which they really like using for competitive matches. With all that being said, however, I too personally heavily prefer maps that give you at least some form of movement option in which you're not constantly getting pelted by the enemy, and some form of flanking option in which you can try to catch an enemy unaware if you get a good timing. ultimately I feel like a map simply funneling you into power positions kind of defeats the point of a power position. In my opinion, you should have to go out of your way to get to a power position, or ideally power positions should be relatively neutral so that both teams can fight for them. Having the team simply give players that press W on both sides power positions tends to make maps very static and very repetitive. Of course, this does bring up another interesting point that many have brought up, and that is that it feels like a World of Tanks map. I can kind of see that this does feel like a World of Tanks map because the lanes are very rigid, the roles for different vehicles on the teams are also very rigid, and the map doesn't really allow for breaking with the pre-designed roles the designers had in mind. Additionally, the mounds of dirt and gravel that you'll find on various corners on the map that allowed you to hide lower front plates or even your entire hull are very reminiscent of World of Tanks hull height obstacles they tend to sprinkle around all their maps that get very tedious to play around. If anyone watched my World of Tanks vs War Thunder comparison series, you notice that I did praise World of Tanks maps for being very good at what they wanted to do, but I also maligned them because what they wanted to do was very boring and very repetitive. You basically only had one thing to do if you were a given type of tank on a given map, and if you had a vehicle that the designers simply hadn't anticipated when designing the map, you just didn't have anything to do. And to an extent, I do feel like Attica kind of ticks those boxes. You can easily end up in scenarios where you have a vehicle that isn't terrifically well suited to any of the given options. All of these factors, from the somewhat limited movement options to the limited places in which certain types of vehicles can play the map to the various terrain features that are less than helpful, make Attica one of my least favorite maps in the map pool right now. But of course, that's just my opinion on the matter. Feel free to let me know down in the comments down below if you love or hate Attica, what your thoughts are, and how far off base you think I am on my assessment of how the map plays. I always love to read your comments. If you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel, and if you have any ideas for the next map for the Worst Map Ever series, feel free to drop that in the comments down below. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.